Hey guys, tonight we travel far, farther than the Colosseum, past the marble baths, and deep into the quiet chambers of memory. You open your eyes to warm light filtering through linen curtains. The stone floor beneath you is cool, the air tinged with laurel and olive oil. You're not in your bed anymore. You're in an ancient Roman villa. Someone importance, judging by the bronze lion heads on the door hinges. You're older now, too. Wiser, slower, but somehow more alive. A servant in crisp linen sets down a small dish of dates and soft goat cheese. You hear a voice call from the peristyle garden. Come, the mind must be walked, not dragged. That's your mentor, an old Roman general, well into his 80s, but his posture is still defiant, like a statue of Mars that never got tired. You rise slowly. Your joints creak, but your thoughts feel curiously light, as if the dust of the centuries has cleared. You've arrived at a curious point in time, a space where the old guard of Rome, its surviving commanders and statesmen, are not fading into the background. Instead, they are actively preserving their minds with odd rituals, clever tricks, and something suspiciously close to modern neuroscience. With a toga twist, you follow your guide into a garden shaped like a labyrinth, where marble busts of long-dead philosophers line the path. He pauses beside one and says, "You probably won't survive this memory game, that is, but we all try." His tone is dry. His eyes sparkle. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now. Rome never slept, but you probably should. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. The general begins to walk, slowly tracing his hand across a hedge carved in the shape of a hippocampus. Yes, that part of the brain before it was a part of the brain. He says it reminds him of his childhood, learning the names of legions by counting them along each twist and branch. Every plant in the garden, he explains, has a name, a number, a memory. This is not just topiary, it's a living archive. He gestures to a pomegranate tree. Siege of Carthage. The fruit burst just like their gates. You raise an eyebrow. He nods. Exactly. Never forget a good metaphor, it sticks longer than a scroll. In ancient Rome, memory wasn't just a tool, it was armor. And old warriors like him sharpened it daily. You think of your own brain, emails, passwords, birthdays. Then you look at this old man recalling military formations from 60 years ago by touching a marble turtle. It's impressive, and a little weird, but that's kind of the point. The Roman elite believed aging didn't mean forgetting. They thought of the brain as a villa itself, full of rooms, columns, and spaces you had to sweep clean regularly. To neglect it was to invite collapse, like letting the aqueducts rot. He hands you a wax tablet. It's blank. We begin every day with this. Before the mind fills, it must be smooth. He then scratches a single line. Ego memini. I remember. It's like a mantra, but with more syllables and a Latin accent. Then comes the breakfast ritual. Not just eating, mind you, but memorizing. He picks up 3 olives, a piece of flatbread, and 2 figs. He recites a sentence for each, linking them to battles, treaties, and even a lover's name. Mnemonics, he mutters, but tastier. Historians still argue whether these memory techniques were formalized traditions or just eccentric habits of the elite. Some believe they were passed down in secret, within academies like the Collegium Memoriae. Others say it was more ad hoc, personal rituals shaped by trauma, ego, and a fear of fading into irrelevance. You're starting to suspect it's both. A sparrow lands nearby, chirping as if it has something profound to add. The general chuckles. That bird has been here every morning since Trajan's time. Or maybe I've just convinced myself of that. He winks. Memory here isn't just recall. It's performance, preservation, reinvention. As the morning unfolds, he walks you past a sundial inscribed with famous sayings. Each one is a cue to a story. Time, he says, is a terrible narrator. You have to help it along. You sit beside a mosaic floor that depicts the myth of Mnemosyne, the goddess of memory, mother of the muses. They say she whispered stories to generals in their dreams, he says. Me? I use dried rosemary. He hands you a sprig and instructs you to sniff it before sleep. It binds thought to scent. Works better than any philosopher. You glance around the villa one more time. The orderly layout, the symbols, the layered meaning in every detail. This place isn't just beautiful. It's functional. It's a giant brain in marble and ivy. And you realize, tonight, you're not here to remember battles. You're here to learn how to remember at all. The general stops beside a wide fountain shaped like a lion's mouth. Water trickles in rhythmic pulses. 4 splashes, then silence, then 2 splashes, then silence again. It's not random. Nothing in this villa is random. This, he says, is my memory metronome. You lean in, listening. He's timed the fountain to a cadence he uses when reciting important dates. It's easier to recall facts if they're set to a rhythm. That's why children remember songs better than tax codes. You murmur something about nursery rhymes, and he nods, pleased. Exactly. Except mine go. The Battle of Pharsalus, Pompey in retreat. Caesar eats his lentils, victory complete. You blink. That rhyme definitely didn't show up in any Latin textbooks you remember. He leads you into the atrium, where beams of sunlight filter through the compluvium. The walls are covered in faded frescoes. War scenes, family dinners, philosophers debating in togas. But in one corner, the paint looks oddly modern. You peer closer. It's not paint. It's a memory wall. Small symbols are etched into the plaster. Keys, birds, laurel leaves. One tiny gladiator helmet. 8 memoirs. The general explains. Memory prompts. Each symbol triggers a story I must never forget. You notice that each carving is paired with a date. Some are ancient battles. Others are oddly personal. One simply says, Aurelia's laugh. Another, the day of the quiet sunset. These aren't for anyone else, he says almost defensively. A strong memory isn't just remembering facts. It's remembering why they matter to you. You trail your fingers along the wall. Some of the etchings are so faint they're barely visible. What happens when they fade? You ask. He shrugs. Then I tell the story again, until it doesn't. That, it seems, is the Roman way, retell or be forgotten. Back in the tablinum, the study, he shows you his most prized tool. A series of wax tablets bundled like a primitive flipbook. But instead of writing on them, he carves miniature drawings with a stylus. I draw what I want to remember. One object per concept. This here. He points to what looks like a loaf of bread. That's my tax policy for Gaul. You frown. How does that? He grins. Taxes rise, bread gets thinner.
Elegant, no?
Historians still argue whether Roman generals truly developed complex visual encoding systems, or whether this was just a weird version of scrapbooking. Either way, it worked. Many letters from the period note remarkable recall among retired commanders. Some even claimed their dreams were organized into columns, like scrolls in a library. But memory didn't always come easy. That's where the palace came in. The general walks you through the concept of the method of loci, or memory palace, a technique where ideas are stored in imaginary rooms. Picture your old house, he instructs. Now put a flaming sword in the hallway. That's your next speech's first idea. You laugh, but it makes sense. And you'll never forget that sword now. In his memory palace, each corridor houses a different theme. Politics, war, love, regrets. You peek into one mental room and find a jar of honey. My mother's advice on diplomacy, he explains. Sweet words work better than hard ones. Historians still debate whether Cicero used a palace or a plaza, he adds. But the principle's the same. Architecture is memory with stone shoes. You glance around his real villa and realize, this might be the palace too. Every object, plant, and mosaic is a peg for his mind. Even his clothing helps. His toga, light gray with a wine-colored hem, is dyed differently on purpose. So I can remember which debates I wore it to. Wine equals Senate. Olive equals the baths. Purple equals regret. It's an elaborate mnemonic wardrobe. Roman fashion meets neurological trickery. You try it out yourself, linking your current outfit, a plain tunic and sandals, to the memory of this strange morning. You picture a sandal walking across a tile floor that whispers historical facts. It's weird. It works. Then comes the scent test. He opens a box filled with tiny vials. Lavender, frankincense, myrrh, crushed pine needles. He hands you one. Sniff it. What do you remember? You inhale, and for a second, you're 8 years old again, playing near a pine tree in your grandmother's yard. The general nods like a pleased magician. Smell skips logic. Goes straight to the hippocampus. Perfect for locking in ideas. He claims older Romans would combine scents with oratory practice. Recite your speech while breathing a chosen aroma. Then sniff that scent before the speech. Boom. The words return. It's Pavlov, but for philosophers. Scholars still argue how much of this was science and how much was ritual. Some say the memory methods were taught in private schools. Others insist they were improvised from Greek influence. A few believe certain generals may have exaggerated their total recall for political flair. Like politicians tend to do. You wander into his private library. Scrolls line the walls, many tagged with odd symbols. A fish, a bow, an ear. Those mark how I felt reading each one. The bow? It bored me. The fish? That scroll helped me sleep. You laugh. But there's a pattern emerging here. Everything is linked. Facts are not stored alone. They're packed into scenes, sounds, smells, textures, even emotions. That's how memory works, he says softly. You don't keep the truth. You keep the feeling of it. Outside, the fountain splashes again. The pattern's changed, now 3 splashes, then 1, then 4. He listens carefully. Time for lunch. You blink. You eat based on the fountain? He winks. How else would I remember? Lunch in this villa is another exercise in memory, not just taste but ritual. The table is set with bowls of olives, crusty bread, hard cheese, and a small dish of garum, the Roman answer to fish sauce. It smells like the sea and something slightly worse. You hesitate. The general chuckles. It's unforgettable, right? He says. That's the point. You try a dab. Instantly, your senses are awakened: salt, sour, umami, and then, oddly, a flash of your last trip to the beach. The general watches you closely. We use food to remember too. Each dish has a story. I eat this garum to remind me of Sicily, where I almost died in a storm. Never forget a place that nearly kills you. A servant places a fig tart beside your plate. The general nods. And this? This is for my father. He made these every Saturnalia. Even when the Republic collapsed, that flavor meant stability. Historians often brush past Roman food habits as luxuries or decadence, but some believe that meals were mnemonic devices, tied to location, tradition, and people. A spoonful of lentils might conjure up a speech in the forum. A sip of wine could recall a betrayal. Romans ate not just with taste buds, but with timelines. As you chew slowly, the general explains the concept of ritualized repetition. It was a technique used by older senators. Say something every day at the same time until it becomes a mental pillar. Some would recite the names of old commanders. Others repeated legal codes while trimming their beards. One even whispered the founding myths of Rome into a clay pot before smashing it. Don't ask why. He probably had his reasons. You're beginning to realize that memory in ancient Rome wasn't just a cognitive function. It was a lifestyle, a discipline, a low-key obsession. After lunch, you walk into the hortus, the small private garden behind the villa. It's laid out in neat squares like a miniature military grid. Rosemary, thyme, lavender, and rue bloom in orderly fashion. The general kneels beside a patch of sage. Smell this, he says, crushing a leaf and pressing it to your nose. Sharp, bitter, almost medicinal. This is my battle herb. I sniff it before any negotiation. It triggers my war voice. You chuckle, but he's serious. Each herb here maps to a memory. If I'm forgetting something, I walk the garden. The layout never changes. If I stop and can't remember why I'm at the Basil, well, then I'm losing my mind. It's a literal memory walk, a custom landscape for cognition. Historians still argue whether Roman generals actively planted gardens for mental anchoring, or if this was more of a private eccentricity. But there are letters, scattered references that hint at this practice, especially in old age. Gardens were more than retreats. They were maps of the self. He points to a small statue of Minerva at the center. She guards wisdom. I face her when I meditate on past decisions. It helps me sort what I got right and what I really didn't. The general plucks a single olive from a tree and hands it to you. Taste that. You do. It's astringent, nearly bitter. That's on purpose, he says. Some memories shouldn't be sweet. Later, you find yourself in his study once more, watching him shuffle carved wooden tokens. Each one is inscribed with a Latin verb. These are my verb wheels, he says. When I need to remember an oration, I roll these until the sequence feels right. Action unlocks narrative. It's like mental dice designed to spark speeches. There's a rhythm to all of it: food, scent, ritual, movement, storytelling. Nothing is left to chance. The memory of a Roman elder wasn't just a repository. It was an orchestra, conducted daily. Before you leave the study, he presses a small charm into your hand, a bronze pendant shaped like a lion. Keep it, he says. When you see it, remember today. Remember how memory is made, not found. Outside, the sun casts long shadows over the tiles. The fountain gurgles. 5 beats, a pause, then 2. The wind carries the smell of herbs, and a servant hums an old soldier's tune. All these things are anchors. You understand now, to be an elder in Rome wasn't about retreating into silence. It was about crafting your legacy through meticulous recall. Not just what happened, but how it's felt, remembered, and retold. It's not about a sharp memory. It's about a deep one. You wake to the sound of leather sandals tapping against the marble. The general is already dressed, again in his ceremonial tunic, the deep crimson of a man who remembers both victory and loss. Today, he says, is Recollection Day. Not a real Roman holiday, mind you, but his personal invention. Once a week, he explains, I test the walls of my mind. You trail behind him through the corridor, noticing now how each mosaic tile pattern shifts slightly, waves, then laurel leaves, then geometric knots. It's subtle, but every change matches a room or memory. He's walking through a physical map of thought, and you're just beginning to read the legend. Do you know about the method of loci? He asks as he swings open a heavy cedar door. Of course you do. Everyone mentions it. Cicero wouldn't shut up about it. He's not wrong. The method of loci, also known as the memory palace, was a technique adored by Roman orators. You visualize a place you know well, like your house or a temple. Then you place things you want to remember inside that space, assigning each object or image to a room, a corner, a column. Later, to recall your speech or facts, you mentally walk through the building and retrieve what you've stored. What many don't realize, he says, is that older Romans took this further. They didn't just use real buildings, they built imaginary cities. They added smells, sounds, even weather. A thunderstorm for betrayal. A warm breeze for loyalty. Historians still argue whether these mental cities were purely mnemonic or veered into something more. Emotional rehearsal, therapy, even spiritual refuge. Mine, he says, is based on Alexandria, but I added a few ruins for flair. You sit beside him in a dim study lit only by a single oil lamp. In front of you, a blank wax tablet. He hands you a stylus and says, describe your earliest memory. Don't write the memory. Write the room it lives in. You hesitate, then scribble slowly. A cracked doorway, a smell of wet wool, your mother humming off key. Good, he says. Make that your entry chamber. This exercise, he explains, isn't just about remembering, it's about architecture. Emotional architecture. The older a Roman gets, the more vital it becomes to sort their memories into something structured. Some use temples, some use ships. He once knew a senator who built a mental library where every scroll was blank, but scented differently. Rose for love, laurel for ambition, myrrh for regret. He shrugs. We all cope somehow. Mid-morning, you follow him to a public bath. The steam hits like a ghost from a past life. Warmth floods your skin, your joints soften, and the echo of quiet conversation wraps around you like wool. This, he whispers, is a memory incubator. The baths weren't just for hygiene. They were memory theaters. The rhythm of ritual, undressing, oiling the body, scraping clean with a strigil, soaking in hot water, was repetitive, meditative, and rich with triggers. Old men would meet here not just to gossip but to remember. A nick on the knee from childhood. A political betrayal overheard in the tepidarium. The soft hand of a wife now long gone. Steam carries stories. The general leans back and closes his eyes. The mind softens here, like wax, ready to take new impressions or reveal old ones. A young man nearby recognizes him and nods in deference. The general grins. He forgets names, but never faces. You both sit in silence for a while, the room humming with memory and eucalyptus oil. Then he says something odd. When I die, I hope they cremate me with rosemary. You look over. He smiles. It helps memory, they say. Maybe I'll come back remembering everything. It's a joke, of course, but not entirely. Romans were deeply spiritual about memory. They believed forgetting wasn't just a personal loss. It was a danger to society. Memory anchored values, virtue, and continuity. Without it, a man was nothing. A republic even less. Before you leave the baths, he presses your palm with warm water and says, make a memory of this moment. When you're old and confused, remember the shape of this heat. It'll bring you back. Outside, the sun has climbed high. The streets are louder now. Vendors shouting, children laughing. A poet shouting verses on a corner. But all of it feels distant, like echoes in the walls of your own memory palace. And in the center, a general builds his city of thoughts, brick by careful brick. You're getting the sense that aging in Rome wasn't just accepted, it was cultivated almost like a fine garden. And no one gardens quite like the general. Today, he invites you to a modest villa just outside the city. It's not his, he insists, but a friend's. You later learn that the friend died 15 years ago, and no one's lived here since. The estate is pristine, though dustless, well-kept, and suspiciously untouched by time. You suspect the general visits often. He leads you into a shaded atrium where sunlight filters through grapevines. A stone bench sits beneath a fig tree, and on it, a wax tablet already open, a quill already dipped. He gestures for you to sit. Today, he says, we catalog regrets. You blink. In order, preferably. As far as Roman brain training techniques go, this one feels more emotional than mnemonic. But the general insists. Regrets have weight, and left unfiled, they clutter the corners of memory. You ever walk into a room and forget why? He asks. That's not age. That's emotional hoarding. You try to laugh, but he's already sketching something on his own tablet. A crude drawing of a battlefield. He labels each fallen soldier with a name, not of men but of decisions. Too proud. Spoke too late. Didn't write back. He hands you a stylus again. Name yours. Then we burn them. Turns out this ritual wasn't so rare. Wealthy Romans often participated in what modern minds might call guided forgetting. One senator famously held an annual festival of failures, where guests read aloud their worst decisions and dropped them into a brazier with laughter and wine. Another, more melancholic, held silent meals where regrets were whispered into olives, then buried under an olive tree. Historians still argue whether this was psychological release or performative virtue signaling. Either way, it stuck. Cicero himself once wrote, "A man's regrets must be harvested like spoiled fruit, else they rot the whole grove." You and the general light the small brazier together. The wax tablets hiss as they melt, smoke curling upward like reluctant memories ascending to some half-forgiving god. Better, he says, but not done. After lunch, grapes, olives, some crusty bread you're too sleepy to chew properly. He walks you to the back of the villa. There, behind a garden wall, is a row of statues. Not marble gods, but busts, realistic, grim-faced, and clearly modeled on actual people. Memory anchors, he says. The mind needs shape to hold content. These are his mentors, his adversaries, even a long-lost brother. Each bust has a line chiseled below it. Not their names, but a single lesson. Ask twice. Never drink on campaign. Don't argue at funerals. He stands before the bust of a woman. Sharp features, piercing eyes. The line beneath her reads, "Be honest only with children and the dying." She taught me that, he murmurs. Then died. He doesn't explain who she was. Maybe a wife, maybe not. In Rome, secrets aged like wine, better kept in the dark. This, you realize, is how Romans preserved wisdom. Not in books, not always, but in objects, statues,
Inscription.
even furniture. The philosopher Seneca once had a chair carved with Stoic aphorisms. One general kept his regrets engraved on his sword sheath. Morbid, yes, but oddly efficient. You walk among the busts, running your fingers over the cold stone. Each face stares back, frozen in memory. You wonder if your face might be here someday. Maybe not now. Maybe in the next generation's villa. With a line beneath, "Ask too many questions." Wrote them down anyway. The general notices your gaze. You only forget things you never honored, he says. And maybe that's why all this works. Not because the memory palace is some ancient miracle, but because Romans were relentless about attention. They saw memory not as storage but as ritual. Sacred repetition. Deliberate encoding. You head back through the villa's cool halls, the afternoon sun mellowing into a honeyed glow. The world seems quieter now, your own thoughts echoing louder than before. You start to understand that aging in Rome wasn't about slowing down, it was about deepening. Settling into your mind like a ship into its own shadow on the sea. Before you leave, he places a small wax tablet in your hand. Blank. Next time, he says, bring a memory worth keeping. You nod. But even now, you know this moment is already etched. Somewhere in your mind, under the fig tree, next to a bust with no name yet. You're getting the sense that aging in Rome wasn't just accepted, it was cultivated almost like a fine garden. And no one gardens quite like the general. Today, he invites you to a modest villa just outside the city. It's not his, he insists, but a friend's. You later learn that the friend died 15 years ago, and no one's lived here since. The estate is pristine, though dustless, well-kept, and suspiciously untouched by time. You suspect the general visits often. He leads you into a shaded atrium where sunlight filters through grapevines. A stone bench sits beneath a fig tree, and on it, a wax tablet already open, a quill already dipped. He gestures for you to sit. Today, he says, we catalog regrets. You blink. In order, preferably. As far as Roman brain training techniques go, this one feels more emotional than mnemonic. But the general insists. Regrets have weight, and left unfiled, they clutter the corners of memory. You ever walk into a room and forget why? He asks. That's not age. That's emotional hoarding. You try to laugh, but he's already sketching something on his own tablet. A crude drawing of a battlefield. He labels each fallen soldier with a name, not of men but of decisions. Too proud. Spoke too late. Didn't write back. He hands you a stylus again. Name yours. Then we burn them. Turns out this ritual wasn't so rare. Wealthy Romans often participated in what modern minds might call guided forgetting. One senator famously held an annual festival of failures, where guests read aloud their worst decisions and dropped them into a brazier with laughter and wine. Another, more melancholic, held silent meals where regrets were whispered into olives, then buried under an olive tree. Historians still argue whether this was psychological release or performative virtue signaling. Either way, it stuck. Cicero himself once wrote, "A man's regrets must be harvested like spoiled fruit, else they rot the whole grove." You and the general light the small brazier together. The wax tablets hiss as they melt, smoke curling upward like reluctant memories ascending to some half-forgiving god. Better, he says, but not done. After lunch, grapes, olives, some crusty bread you're too sleepy to chew properly. He walks you to the back of the villa. There, behind a garden wall, is a row of statues. Not marble gods, but busts, realistic, grim-faced, and clearly modeled on actual people. Memory anchors, he says. The mind needs shape to hold content. These are his mentors, his adversaries, even a long-lost brother. Each bust has a line chiseled below it. Not their names, but a single lesson. Ask twice. Never drink on campaign. Don't argue at funerals. He stands before the bust of a woman. Sharp features, piercing eyes. The line beneath her reads, "Be honest only with children and the dying." She taught me that, he murmurs. Then died. He doesn't explain who she was. Maybe a wife, maybe not. In Rome, secrets aged like wine, better kept in the dark. This, you realize, is how Romans preserved wisdom. Not in books, not always, but in objects, statues,
Inscription.
even furniture. The philosopher Seneca once had a chair carved with Stoic aphorisms. One general kept his regrets engraved on his sword sheath. Morbid, yes, but oddly efficient. You walk among the busts, running your fingers over the cold stone. Each face stares back, frozen in memory. You wonder if your face might be here someday. Maybe not now. Maybe in the next generation's villa. With a line beneath, ask too many questions. Wrote them down anyway. The general notices your gaze. You only forget things you never honored, he says. And maybe that's why all this works. Not because the memory palace is some ancient miracle, but because Romans were relentless about attention. They saw memory not as storage but as ritual. Sacred repetition. Deliberate encoding. You head back through the villa's cool halls, the afternoon sun mellowing into a honeyed glow. The world seems quieter now, your own thoughts echoing louder than before. You start to understand that aging in Rome wasn't about slowing down, it was about deepening, settling into your mind like a ship into its own shadow on the sea. Before you leave, he places a small wax tablet in your hand. Blank. Next time, he says, bring a memory worth keeping. You nod. But even now, you know this moment is already etched. Somewhere in your mind, under the fig tree, next to a bust with no name yet. The curtain parts before dawn, and soft orange light spills into your room like a cautious messenger. You rise slowly, still holding the silence of the memory relay in your bones. The general is already outside, watching the horizon as though he has an appointment with it. Today, he says, is for the scribes. You follow him down a winding path toward a smaller building nestled between olive groves. Unlike the harsh lines of Roman military camps or the marble pride of civic forums, this place looks almost shy, built into the hillside, with vines crawling up its sides like they're trying to cover it in whispers. Inside, the air is thick with the smell of ink, wax, and dried laurel leaves. This is the Tablinarium Senex, the old men's archive. But there are no scrolls, no codices lining the walls. Instead, what you find are memory tablets. Hundreds of them. Thin wooden frames filled not with writing but with impressions. Finger marks, scorch patterns, wax ridges hardened into the shape of thoughts long evaporated. One of the scribes, a stooped man with eyebrows like storm clouds, explains, "We don't write down our memories, we record how they feel. Then, when we forget, we can touch the tablet and remember the shape of remembering." You run your fingers across one, a gentle swirl carved near the edge. This, the scribe says, was a lover's laugh. The third one, to be precise. Another bears what looks like a gouge. Anger, he says, but not the first wave. The quieter one, after the letter went unanswered. Historians still debate the function of these tactile archives. Some argue they were personal mnemonic tools, early therapeutic aids for soldiers who'd seen too much. Others believe they were part of a larger spiritual practice, a kind of Roman mindfulness training before such words existed. One particularly skeptical historian once wrote, "They were probably just bored. But as you handle tablet after tablet, it becomes clear these were not born of boredom. They are grief held in geometry, joy frozen into texture. Each mark tells less of a story and more of an emotion, abstract, but unmistakably human. You're invited to make your own. A small bowl of warm wax is brought forward. You dip your fingers in. First, you hesitate. What do you even want to remember? You close your eyes. The silence of the soldiers pacing around the circle. The rhythm of barley stew being stirred to the name of a dead friend. The rough weight of a fig, thin as a broken promise. And slowly, your fingers begin to move. You make a simple spiral, then press your thumb in once. Firm, steady. That's it. The scribe nods, satisfied. You'll know what it means when you touch it again. Later, the general shows you another practice, one known as the Noti Nostra or our marks. These were tiny glyphs that veterans would draw or trace into the corners of their homes, shields, or even their skin. The marks were not standardized. They were deeply personal. A triangle with one side shaded might mean lost a friend in Germania. A curve broken by a line might mean almost drowned in the Tiber but laughed about it later. They weren't language. They were anchors, symbols designed not to tell others, but to remind the self. A kind of memory graffiti, scribbled not to be read, but to be felt. You try one. A line, then a dot, then a curl. You don't name it. That would ruin it. The general shows you his burned faintly into the inside of his wrist. A series of half circles with a sharp break. He doesn't explain it. You don't ask. Before leaving the archive, you're offered one more ritual, the revisita. This is the act of revisiting a memory aloud. Not just once, but differently each time. Say it again, the scribe urges. But use new words. Find new textures. Walk through it backwards if you must. You try. First, you say, "We marched in silence through the dust." Then, "The silence was thick, made of dust and duty." Finally, "Each footstep swallowed our thoughts." The scribe nods. That one will hold. As you step out into the afternoon sun, the general says something that sounds half like a proverb, half like a goodbye. The mind forgets names, but the soul remembers sensations. And with that, you head back toward the stone path, the wax cooling on your fingertips, the marks still soft in your skin, and the memory of remembering. Still fresh, still strange. Somewhere behind you, a scribe begins humming. Not a melody, a memory. The sun slinks low over the horizon, casting a coppery shimmer across the rooftops of the Roman outpost. You're starting to realize something about these old warhorses. They don't remember in grand, sweeping epics. They remember in shadows, in smells, in the tick of a bronze gear or the tremble of a vine leaf. This evening, you're brought to the Thermopolium, an open-air Roman tavern, modest but bustling, a favorite haunt of retired centurions who've traded battle for broth. The general waves at a man behind the counter, who appears to have the muscle tone of a marble statue left too long in the rain. He smiles. "This one's a repetitor," the general says. "A memory coach. He's better than wine." You find your way to a bench worn down by countless stories, and he begins. "Let's play a game," he says, sliding you a small clay bowl filled with black olives. "Name the battle these came from." You blink. He grins. "Exactly. You can't. But if you chew slowly, pay attention, you might find the memory." You bite. Salt. Earth. Just a bit of anise. He nods. "Now name the cook who made them." And you do. You see him in your mind. Short, angry, always muttering about undercooked fish. Memory not from the olive, but from its edges. This, the repetitor explains, is edge training. A Roman technique to remember the unmemorable by anchoring it to strong sensory triggers, especially the ones that hide behind more obvious tastes and textures. Soldiers used this to recall field strategies, not through maps or commands, but through remembered smells. The scent of a certain resin meant retreat if flanked. The taste of over-fermented fish sauce? Double up the rear guard. Modern researchers call it associative recall. But the Romans didn't have neuroscience journals. They had cheese. One tidbit you'll never unhear. Some Roman legions purposefully rotated meals on a strict flavor cycle. Not for diet, but for memory. Tuesday, garlic gruel. So if someone yells Tuesday, in battle, you remember the formation drilled that day. Historians still debate whether this practice was widespread or just a clever mnemonic hack used by more eccentric commanders. One fresco even shows a soldier saluting a steaming onion like it's a standard bearer. As the evening air cools, the repetitor brings out his tools. Tiny amphorae filled with oil infusions, rose, mustard seed, myrrh, and something suspiciously like feet. You're to identify each one by one, then tell a story sparked by it. The rose makes you think of a bathhouse in Carthage. The mustard reminds you of your grandfather's warnings about spoiled lentils. The feet-smelling one, you say nothing. Some memories are best left unnamed. The general chuckles. Now you know why we say the nostrils never lie. It's not all scent and sauce, though. Next comes the reticula verba, a memory net made of words. You're handed a list of seemingly random Latin phrases. Silver wolf, broken aqueduct, three-legged chair, melon in winter. You're to link them into a single, absurd story. The repetitor gives you 60 seconds. And somehow you manage. The silver wolf drinks from the broken aqueduct, climbs a three-legged chair, and offers a winter melon to Jupiter. Everyone applauds. Absurdity, the memory coach says, is the best anchor. That's why all the most boring senators are also the most forgetful. This technique, known as the catena ridiculosa, was favored by orators who had to memorize hours of speech without scrolls. The weirder the imagery, the harder it clings to the mind. Roman courts were likely filled with men recalling complex tax codes by picturing purple chickens with scrolls tied to their ankles. There's even an apocryphal tale of Cato the Elder winning a debate simply because he remembered to say Carthago delenda est at exactly the right moment, having anchored it in his mind by picturing Carthage as a smoldering cabbage. The general now hands you a worn leather pouch. Inside are 4 pebbles. He doesn't explain them. You're to use each one as a trigger. Not to recall something from today, but something from your past. Your real past. You try. First pebble. Smooth. Cold. Reminds you of sitting on your kitchen floor during a blackout. The fridge humming for no reason. Second. Warm from the sun. Brings up a forgotten birthday. One where the cake melted before candles could be lit. Third. Jagged edge. Sharp as the first time someone lied to you. Fourth. Perfectly round. Like the moon on that one night you tried to forget. You set them down, quietly stunned. These are your new tools. The general says, voice softer than before. We remember through our bodies, not just our minds. Even the Stoics knew that. Historians still argue about whether these memory games were widespread among the legions or if they were eccentricities of an elite few. Some point to scattered mosaics depicting soldiers tossing bones and muttering rhymes. Others scoff, saying it's all poetic exaggeration, wishful thinking painted over brutal lives. But tonight, sitting under a sky stippled with stars, you begin to believe that remembering, truly remembering, is less about facts and more about texture, about play, about creating just enough oddity to make your mind pause, blink, and whisper, ah, yes, I know this. The general leans back, eyes closed, murmuring something about roasted pine nuts and the scent of old parchment. You don't speak, you just breathe it all in. You're deep into the game now. The night air is gentler than before, almost conspiratorial, as if the stars themselves are leaning in to hear the next trick. The general walks ahead, torch in hand, leading you away from the thermopolium and down a narrow path toward a quiet courtyard tucked behind the forum. Here, there's no crowd, no laughter, just an ancient tree, twisted and grand, like something out of a forgotten myth. Its roots crawl across the stone like fingers reaching for memory. He gestures for you to sit. You do, and with a smile that suggests both pride and mischief, he draws out a box. It's carved from olive wood, stained darker in the corners from years of handling. When he lifts the lid, you half expect some secret relic, But instead, you find a pile of ordinary wax tablets. Let me tell you about the method of loci, he says. You nod. You've heard of it before, palace of memory, mental mapping, all that. But tonight, it's different. He doesn't just talk about it. He makes you build one. Close your eyes, he instructs. Picture your boyhood home. Yes, that one, with the broken step and the lemon tree out front. Now, inside it, place 10 absurd objects. A golden cabbage in the entryway. A flamingo in your kitchen sink. A scroll singing lullabies on your bed. The more ridiculous, the better. This is how Roman senators remembered speeches so long they could make an olive tree bloom just from the hot air. They built memory palaces out of familiar places and filled them with chaos. Modern scientists still marvel at how well this works. Neurologically speaking, the hippocampus lights up like a Roman festival when faced with strong spatial associations. The method of loci turns memory from abstract list into a walkable museum of nonsense. Some even claim this technique made it into Roman military drills. That commanders could map entire battlegrounds into the halls of their family villas, walking mentally through flank positions by pacing their mother's kitchen. Historians still argue whether Julius Caesar used such tricks. There's no clear proof. But given the sheer volume of names, places, treaties, and betrayals he juggled, it's not unlikely he kept a few flamingos in his mental foyer. You're handed a stylus and one of the wax tablets. Now, the general says, make yours. The wax is smooth and strangely warm. You begin scratching in symbols. Some Roman numerals, a lion, a boat with wings, and a loaf of bread wearing a crown. There's no logic. That's the point. He explains how these tablets weren't just notebooks. They were portable memory trainers. Roman officers would scratch in odd symbols during the day, only to erase and reconstruct them later, rehearsing the memory of creation itself. You don't just remember the list, he says. You remember the motion, the curve of the line, the exact press of the stylus. Roman scholars called it tactus memoriae, tactile memory. You might call it learning with your fingers. Even in temples, scribes used stylus exercises to recall sacred texts. One surviving fragment mentions a priest who could remember all 12 books of a prophecy simply by tapping his fingers in a specific pattern across his tablet's edges. That part might be apocryphal, or maybe he was just very bored, but the technique worked. You're halfway through your third tablet when the general adds another twist. Try this, he says. Now walk your memory palace backwards. You frown. Why? Because surprise cements memory. If you only recall things in one order, you're chained to it. But if you can reverse your thoughts, they become architecture. You give it a try. The crowned loaf in the attic. The winged boat in the hallway. The lion pacing near the lemon tree. It does stick. Stronger than you expected. Now he takes one of your tablets and holds it over the firelight. The wax melts slightly, exposing deeper grooves beneath. You know what this is? He asks. Layered memory. Apparently, some Roman scholars would etch an initial layer of truth into the wax, say military formations, then overlay nonsense over it. By remembering both layers, they could test their recall without ever looking at the original. Like writing with invisible ink, but made of confusion. Modern researchers might call it dual encoding. The Romans just called it clever. Historians debate whether such wax layering was an actual practice or just an allegorical tale passed around elite schools. There's no solid archaeological evidence. Wax doesn't exactly last. But some literary references hint at it, especially among Stoic circles. Speaking of Stoics, the general finally leans against the tree and mentions Epictetus. Ah yes, he sighs. The philosopher who said the only thing you ever truly own is your mind. Turns out, Epictetus encouraged his students to intentionally forget one thing a day, to keep their minds from growing too rigid. It was called amnesia voluntaria, voluntary forgetfulness. So every night, you'd pick a fact, a name, a location, and let it go. Because if you can't forget, he says, then you can't choose what matters. You sit in silence, wax cooling in your hands, watching the old general close his eyes and hum a soft melody that might have once been a marching tune. He's forgotten parts of it, but not the rhythm. And for tonight, that's enough. The torch is flickering low now, but the general shows no sign of retreating. He turns the wax tablets over in his palm, the edges glossy from the firelight, and says softly, "Come, there's one more trick, something older than Rome herself." You trail behind him, your wax still warm, your mind buzzing with lions and flaming bread. The courtyard gives way to a dim corridor carved into stone, colder than before. You pass ancient inscriptions, the lettering half-worn but still assertive. Names of ancestors, mottos of duty, fragments of forgotten prayers. You finally arrive at what looks like a chapel, but not for the gods. This room is for the dead. Rows of busts line the walls. Ancestors, commanders, family patriarchs, each cast in marble or plaster. Some are cracked, others still gleam, and in the center, under a dome that lets in just a whisper of starlight, stands a life-sized wax figure. It's eerie, too real, too quiet. That, the general says, is a lararium, a household shrine to memory. The great Roman families kept them, complete with death masks of their ancestors. You take a slow step closer. The face looks peaceful, but there's something deeply alive about it. Maybe it's the detail in the wrinkles or the way the mouth almost smiles. These masks, imagines Maiorum, were cast from the actual faces of the deceased. Literal molds taken shortly after death, meant to preserve not just the image but the presence. Romans believed memory lived in the face. More than that, they believed remembering your elders kept them from fading in the afterlife. You feel the chill in the room differently now. There was a ritual for this. On major holidays, like the Parinalia, families would carry these death masks through the streets in slow processions, recounting each ancestor's deeds aloud. It wasn't just mourning, it was reinstallation, rewriting the story into the family's collective memory. Modern psychologists call this rehearsed recall, and it does wonders for memory retention. You repeat a narrative and it reinforces the neural connections, makes the past not just known but lived. Some Roman elites even paid actors to wear these masks during funerals, to speak in the voice of the dead. Imagine giving your eulogy while someone in your face walks beside your coffin. Creepy? Maybe. But memorable? Absolutely. Historians still argue whether this practice was widespread or mostly reserved for patrician families trying to flex their lineage. The more skeptical among them suggest the whole thing may have been more symbolic, less about memory, more about myth-making. But tonight, surrounded by these wax faces, it feels intimate, feels real. The general places a small oil lamp before one of the busts, his father's, maybe, and says something under his breath. You don't ask what. Instead, you look at the mask again and notice something peculiar. It has writing carved into the inside of the cheeks. You ask. He nods.
A memoria sculpta.
Some believe that by writing a phrase, an ideal, a warning, even a joke, inside the mask, it would live on. Only those who prepared the mask would know what was hidden. Like whispering your will into the folds of your own memory. You wonder what the phrase might be. Something noble? Or something absurd? Like, don't forget to feed the geese? He doesn't say. What he does say is this. We Romans had no word for retirement. Not really. We had odium, leisure, but that wasn't rest. That was study, self-discipline, philosophy, the work of memory. He leans closer and says, old age wasn't when your memory faded. It was when it mattered most. That's why older men dominated the Senate, the courts, even military command. Not because of brute strength, but because they remembered better than anyone else. They had libraries in their minds. They had layers of strategy hidden in their scars. Seneca once wrote that the best old men were like well-tended vineyards, full-bodied, seasoned, patient, and full of vintage knowledge. Sure, sometimes they forgot names or birthdays, but ask them how to outflank a Parthian scout party in winter, and they'd give you 3 options and a poem about each one. The general finally motions to leave. But before you go, he hands you something wrapped in cloth. You expect a tablet, maybe another stylus. But it's a small bronze mirror. You've built your palace. You've carved your symbols. But here, this is to check that what you remember is still you. You look into it. Your face stares back, candle warmed, sleep heavy, a little older than before, a little wiser. Memory, he says as he walks away, isn't just about the past. It's how you hold yourself together in the present. Behind you, the wax faces remain still, watching, maybe listening, maybe forgetting you, slowly. But you won't forget them. Not tonight. You rise early the next day, though early is a relative concept when you're living in centuries past. There's a subtle mist curling along the villa's columns, and the scent of olive oil, damp parchment, and old marble lingers in the air. Somewhere nearby, a servant hums a low tune as he sharpens reed pens. Today, the general says you're heading to the baths. Not for cleanliness, though the Romans were famously fastidious, but for memory training. Yes, really? He chuckles as you look confused. Memory is a full-body discipline. You can't just cram scrolls and hope your brain behaves. You need rhythm, repetition, ritual. And where better than the baths? So you follow him to the Thermae, the grand public baths of Rome. As you walk, he explains how memory wasn't just about information, it was a social muscle. Something you flexed in public like abs or oratory. The baths, sprawling like palaces, weren't only for hygiene or gossip. They were cultural amphitheaters where elite minds met to rehearse arguments, recite poetry, and, occasionally, insult each other with style. You step into the apoditorium, the changing room, and he points to the painted walls. They're a cheat sheet, he grins. Indeed, frescoes of mythological tales sprawl across the plaster. Hercules wrestling the Hydra, Odysseus tricking Polyphemus. Each figure is larger than life, each detail memorably dramatic. These weren't just for decoration, they were mnemonic devices. The method of loci, or the memory palace technique, finds one of its earliest homes right here. The idea? Associate information with vivid spatial imagery. As you walk through a building or a bath, you mentally store items of memory in distinct spots. So a fresco of Apollo might help you remember the opening of a speech. The warm bench in the caldarium? That's where you park that list of battle formations. The chilly plunge pool? That's where the names of your political enemies go, because it helps you remember to give them the cold shoulder. Even modern psychologists admit this technique works absurdly well. And it's still taught today in competitive memory circuits. Yes, those exist. Historians still debate whether the average Roman really used the method of loci in everyday life, or if it was mostly a rhetorical trick for ambitious senators. But here in the baths, as voices echo off the domes and the steam makes your thoughts float oddly slow, it all feels possible. As you step into the tepidarium, the warm bath, the general gestures toward a group of older men seated in a semicircle. They're not bathing, they're reciting. One by one, each stands and delivers a line of Virgil or Cicero, flawlessly. And then they laugh, not at each other, but with the pleasure of recall, like a muscle snapping back into shape. They see you and invite you forward. Someone hands you a line, just a single line of text, and tells you to walk with it. Not just read. Walk. So you pace slowly around the perimeter of the pool, repeating the phrase aloud, glancing at statues, at tiles, at arches. You associate each word with a detail. You say, "Time wears down all empires." You notice a crack in the mosaic floor where Neptune's trident meets the sea. You say it again. You notice a chip in the marble lion's eye. You say it again. By the time you return to the group, the line is carved into you like a name in wet concrete. You recite it perfectly. They nod approvingly. One of the older men leans over and mutters, "Not bad, for a newcomer with wet feet." He slaps your shoulder, and his palm is like worn leather. Then, a brief argument erupts over which version of the line is more accurate. Was it empire or kingdom? Did Virgil write it or borrow it? Historians still argue whether these oral traditions preserved the texts faithfully or distorted them over time. Some claim that Rome's obsession with recitation stifled creativity, that memorizing too much left no room for new thought. But here in the baths, surrounded by echo and heat, feels less like restriction and more like ritual, like lighting a candle in the same spot every day. Eventually, you descend into the frigidarium, the cold bath. And there, with a jolt, you realize something. This plunge, the literal shock to the system, wasn't just about closing pores or bracing the body. It was a reset, a way to shake off mental fatigue and sharpen recall. The Romans believed that alternating temperature, hot and cold, sharpened focus. Modern neuroscience might call it neuroplasticity via stimulation. Romans just called it common sense. You sit in the icy water, breath shallow, eyes half closed. And as your body chills, your mind clears. You remember the wax masks, the procession of ancestors, the fresco of Apollo, the crack in Neptune's trident, the sentence, "Time wears down all empires." You didn't try to remember it. It just returned. And in that moment, half shivering, half smiling, you understand something strange and simple. Rome never needed hard drives. They had corridors. They had faces. They had baths. And they had you, walking, reciting, forgetting, and remembering again. Later that afternoon, you're back at the general's villa, wrapped in a soft woolen tunic and sipping something vaguely bitter. Possibly mulled wine, possibly medicinal. The general claims it's good for blood flow and brain clarity, though you suspect it's mainly good at making you sleepy. Today's lesson, he says, will not be about war or oratory or any great conquest. It's about food. Specifically, what you eat when you want to remember things longer than 5 minutes. You arch an eyebrow. Surely he's not about to lecture you on snacks. "Oh, but I am," he says, leaning back into his carved wooden chair with a theatrical sigh. Memory doesn't live in your scrolls. It lives in your stomach. As strange as it sounds, ancient Roman diets were closely linked with beliefs about mental health and memory. The general rattles off a list of ingredients that would make a modern nutritionist swoon. Rosemary, garlic, olives, honey, fish oil, chickpeas. "Eat like a soldier," he mutters. "Think like a senator." In fact, rosemary was nicknamed the herb of remembrance. You watch as he plucks a sprig from a nearby planter and crushes it between his fingers. The scent fills the air, woodsy, sharp, ancient. Modern researchers have found some truth in this. Rosemary contains compounds that may enhance memory. That's right. Your sleepy nighttime salad garnish might have been the secret weapon of Roman war councils. He walks you to the kitchen, if you can call it that. It's half-stone oven, half-open fire, with clay jars lining the walls like sleepy soldiers. There's dried garum, a fermented fish sauce, salted olives, aged cheese wrapped in fig leaves. The cook, a wiry man with a sun-creased face and the permanent expression of someone unimpressed by senators, offers you a strange stew with barley, lentils, and, of all things, pine nuts. Brain food, the general says, tapping his temple. Historians still argue whether the Roman elite truly believed in cognitive enhancement through diet or if these choices were just class signals. Status foods for status minds. Some scholars insist it was more symbolic than scientific. Bitter greens for bitterness in battle, honey for sweet victory. But as you slurp the thick stew, you can't help but feel sharper. Or maybe just more full. After lunch, he leads you outside to the garden. A carefully pruned space with boxwood hedges and a few lemon trees. The light is golden now, slanting low like it knows its time is running short. He points to a stone bench carved with Latin phrases and invites you to sit. And then he tells you about the art of forgetting. You blink. Isn't that the opposite of what you're here to learn? No, he says. It's part of the same game. The memory of a good general must be selective. It's something Roman philosophers obsessed over, how to unburden the mind. Seneca, the evergrim Stoic, wrote about clearing mental clutter like you clear a crowded atrium. You don't hold on to everything. You choose what's worth keeping. He has you close your eyes. He says, picture a room, your memory room. Fill it with the faces of comrades, the names of rivers, the routes of campaigns. You do. It's full, almost buzzing. Then he says, now walk out of that room. Shut the door. Breathe. You do. And it's oddly peaceful. Not because you've forgotten, but because you've accepted that not everything deserves to be remembered. You sit there a while longer, rosemary on your fingertips, stew in your belly, your head full of frescoes and forgotten emperors. Then he gives you a test. He asks you the names of his childhood tutors. You blink. You weren't paying attention when he mentioned them in passing days ago. You shrug. He nods. Good. You look confused. It means you remembered what mattered. The rest is just noise. Let it go. There's a moment of silence. A breeze nudges the lemon tree, and one yellow fruit drops with a thud onto the gravel. Even the tree, it seems, knows when to let go. You get up from the bench and walk with him back toward the villa. Evening has drawn long shadows across the garden. Somewhere, someone is starting to recite a poem. You only catch fragments. Something about exile, about stars, about time. You don't try to remember the words, but you remember the voice, and that might be enough. You sleep surprisingly well that night, lulled by the scent of rosemary and the slow rhythm of Roman nighttime. Distant sandals on stone, the hush of cicadas, the occasional clink of amphorae being moved under moonlight. When you wake, the general is already in the courtyard, dressed in a toga that suggests he's expecting visitors. But there's no one else around. Just him, and an odd object laid out on a marble pedestal. There's a wax tablet, 2 wooden panels, bound like a primitive book, filled with smooth, dark wax and etched with rows of shallow grooves. He hands you a stylus. You've learned to remember, he says. Now learn to rehearse. Repetition, he explains, was the Roman brain's best friend. Great minds like Cicero and Seneca didn't just memorize by chance. They wrote and rewrote ideas into wax, then read them aloud in rhythm. You think music helps you remember modern things? He grins. Try reciting speeches in dactylic hexameter. You press the stylus into the wax. The tip drags a satisfying line as you copy out a fragment from Virgil. Something about storms or fate, or gods behaving badly. Surprisingly calming. And yes, the Romans used these tablets for more than idle doodles. Students, lawyers, even soldiers used them to train memory, writing down legal arguments, logistics plans, or enemy troop movements, then scraping them clean to begin again. It's memory, layered over memory, like palimpsests on parchment. He has you copy a simple phrase 5 times. Then he erases it and asks you to recite it back. Your brain freezes. You're relying too much on the wax, he says, tapping your forehead. The real wax is in here. Make the grooves deeper. Modern scholars might call this neuroplasticity. The Romans just called it praxis, practice, and they believed that nothing worth knowing ever stayed put without repetition. Historians still argue whether Roman students truly reached advanced mastery through this method or whether they just became very good at parroting. Either way, the wax tablet became a symbol of focused thought, short-term memory made tangible, then recycled. He leaves you to your copying and goes to speak with a visitor. A stern man with ink-stained hands and a scroll that looks older than the wall behind him. You catch only fragments of their conversation. Something about archives, something about time, something about a battle near the Rhine. It's not for you to know, not yet. Instead, you spend the next hour repeating the general's instructions, writing them again and again until the grooves in the wax become almost muscle memory. There's something meditative about it. You begin to understand that the memory of a Roman wasn't just in the mind, it was in the hand, the tongue, the rhythm of repetition. By mid-morning, the general returns with a new assignment. Poetry. You stifle a groan. He explains that many Roman generals memorized lines of Latin verse not for art's sake, but to sharpen mental precision. Ovid, Horace, and of course, Virgil, these weren't just poets, they were mnemonic tools. Every great memory, he says, is tied to rhythm. He gives you one stanza, short, dense, lyrical. You chant it under your breath, trying to feel the cadence settle into your bones. And suddenly it sticks. Not just the words, but the sound, the shape, the feeling. He nods. Now, whisper it while you walk. You do. Through the corridor, past the courtyard, beneath the arch with faded frescoes. You're murmuring Latin like a sleepwalker. And somehow your brain isn't protesting, it's cooperating. This is how memory becomes embodied. You begin to realize that the Romans didn't just memorize facts. They memorized formats, poems, speeches, lists, prayers. These frameworks made information easier to retrieve. And strangely, it works. One part of your brain is saying, "Why am I reciting ancient poetry at 9 in the morning?" While another part whispers, "Because you'll remember this moment forever." You walk back to the courtyard, the words echoing quietly in your mind like a soft drumbeat. It's strange how memory, once you stop treating it like a task, becomes a companion. The general offers you a cup of watered wine and leans against a pillar. He looks pleased, maybe even proud. Then he says, "Let's talk about forgetting again." You blink. "But He raises a hand. "Not everything you write in wax deserves to be carved in stone." And just like that, the lesson changes again. That afternoon, you find yourself standing in the villa's shaded atrium, staring at a wall where dozens of small symbols have been scratched into the plaster. Some are numbers. Others resemble birds, spirals, even a fish with a crown. The general gestures toward them. "Memory is not about clinging," he says, "but choosing what to forget." You frown, confused. All this effort to remember, now he wants to teach you how to let go. He smiles as if reading your thoughts. "Roman minds were trained not only to absorb but to release," he explains. "Otherwise, you drown in your own memories." And so begins the strangest lesson yet. Oblivio, the art of forgetfulness. You wouldn't think ancient generals had time for such things, but you'd be wrong. Roman elites carefully curated their minds. Like a senator trimming his library, they discarded obsolete memories to make space for what mattered. A mental decluttering. A psychic spring cleaning. The general shows you an exercise he calls memoria translatio, a memory migration. You're to take a memory from your early days in the villa, say, your first awkward dinner or that walk through the olive grove, and consciously move it to a mental archive. Picture it being wrapped in cloth, placed in a chest, and pushed to the corner of your mind. It's odd at first, imagining memory as a scroll room with dusty shelves. But it works. This isn't erasure. It's shelving. Historians still debate, he mutters while you work, whether Roman memory rituals were symbolic or truly effective. But those debates miss the point. Belief fuels the method. A centurion passes by, nods at your trance-like posture, and chuckles. He's probably done this 100 times. In your next exercise, the general asks you to list the 10 most trivial things you've memorized this week. You list the layout of the guest bath, the dog's name, it's Clodius, the pattern of tiles near the garden, that the baker has a lazy eye, the smell of old papyrus, the number of steps to the grain storage, your breakfast rotation, olives, bread, dates, the chirp pattern of the third bird from the left, which wine is watered, the exact noise a toga makes when folded. Then he makes you forget 5 of them. Not truly forget, but deprioritize, push them into the periphery, relocate them to a mental zone he calls the dust gallery. Not destroyed, just neglected on purpose. It's hard. You feel like you're betraying the loyalty of your own senses. But that's the Roman trick. Discipline over emotion. You think you have a bad memory, he says, but you just have an undisciplined one. He's quoting Seneca now, the Stoic philosopher who once said that memory fails not from weakness but from clutter. Seneca practiced daily mental reviews, what he called contia memoriae, where he sorted the day's input like a shopkeeper counting coins. You're told to do the same before sleep tonight. And to burn, mentally of course, at least one useless thought. Meanwhile, in the library, a scholar in a purple-trimmed toga is drawing diagrams on wax. He's sketching what looks like a theater, but with names instead of seats. You peer over his shoulder. It's a memory palace, a Roman method of loci. He walks you through it gently and slowly. A grand building in your mind, each room filled with symbols, names, dates, scents, songs. A mental museum. You get to build it. You get to paint the walls. Want Cicero in the foyer? Done. Need a grocery list tied to busts of the emperors? Go wild. But here's the twist, the palace has limits. Just like real palaces, Once it fills, you have to renovate, rebuild, or remove rooms. It's like mental architecture with a demolition crew on retainer. By nightfall, you're exhausted, not from physical strain, but from the delicate work of sculpting and pruning your inner world. Before bed, the general offers one last piece of advice. If you carry every stone from every road you've walked, you'll never get far. So you light a mental fire. You toss in that memory of Clodius the dog barking at shadows, the taste of sour wine on day 2, the panic when you forgot the word for aqueduct. They rise in imaginary smoke, faint but freeing, and then you sleep, not because your mind is full, but because it's finally light enough to rest. You wake up unusually refreshed, not just in body, but in mind, like someone swept the floors of your skull while you slept. Outside, the general greets you with a nod and a piece of bread slathered in honey. He doesn't say good morning. Romans weren't sentimental that way. Instead, he points to a column with a carved face near the stables. Time to teach your memory to talk back, he says. You arch an eyebrow. He means dialogue-based recall, a Roman technique where memory becomes a conversation. Instead of simply trying to remember something, you imagine the knowledge questioning you. The carved face? That's just a visual crutch. He demonstrates. What is the fourth principle of oration? He says aloud to the face. Then he answers, memoria, the ability to recall arguments without pause. Now it's your turn. He hands you a list of questions, random, obscure, and annoyingly specific. What did the baker say about the flour delivery on the Ides? What color was the senator's ring yesterday? What name was carved into the 5th tile on the garden path? You stammer. Guess. Fail. Guess again. Then you try something different. You become the questioner. You begin to ask the memory itself, hey, image of the baker, what were you complaining about again? And somehow the answer bubbles up. It feels like conjuring ghosts. Polite ones. Well-spoken. Historians still argue whether this practice was widespread or confined to elite tutors and philosophers. Some claim it's a late invention. Others say it dates back to the early republic, passed from orator to orator like a secret handshake. You're not sure. You just know it's working. And then, as if this mental exercise weren't strange enough, the general introduces music. Romans, it turns out, believed that sound had memory-binding power. He claps his hands, and a young boy appears with a small lyre. He strums a short tune, nothing grand, just 5 notes, and the general asks you to attach those notes to a list of 5 places in your memory palace. The atrium, the scriptorium, the stables, the bathhouse, the olive press. You recite, assigning 1 place to each note. Later, when he strums the same notes again, the images return instantly. The atrium's dusty smell, the creak of the library floor, the splash of water. It's eerie, like your mind was waiting for the cue. You wonder aloud if this is magic. He scoffs.
No.
Just how brains prefer to sing their truths. He's quoting again, possibly Cato or maybe a tavern philosopher. You've stopped trying to verify everything. After lunch, he lets you rest. You sit beneath a fig tree, watching the wind tug at the leaves like an old storyteller flipping pages. There's a humming stillness to the garden. Even the birds seem like they're trying to remember something. And then, because you've learned by now that nothing in this villa is random, the general tosses you a carved dice. Time to test yourself. The dice aren't for gambling. Each face holds a symbol. An olive branch, a Roman numeral, a little amphora, a stylized eye, a door, and a spiral. Each corresponds to a type of memory. Olive branch equals names. Numeral equals dates. Amphora equals objects. I equals visual details.
Door is gelijk aan locations.
Spiral equals abstract ideas. You roll. Amphora. He demands the full inventory of the apothecary's shelf. You rattle off what you can. Saffron, myrrh, crushed beetles, something that smells like vinegar and guilt. He nods. Roll again. Door. He asks for the exact layout of the guest wing. How many paces to the second bedroom? What color were the mosaic borders? You struggle but grin. It's working. Your brain is no longer a leaky barrel. By dusk, you're not just remembering, you're retrieving at will. Your memory palace isn't a curiosity anymore. It's a fortress, and like all fortresses, it needs regular patrol. The general's final lesson that day is simple. Memory doesn't age. Only laziness does. He says Roman generals over 50 could still quote entire speeches, recite battlefield formations, and name every horse in their cavalry. Not because they had perfect brains, but because they trained them like soldiers. So, as the moon rises, and the sounds of the villa soften into candlelight and whispers, you lie in your cot and imagine your palace one more time. Tonight, you walk its halls with quiet pride. You open a mental door. Inside is a face, asking you gently, "Are you still listening?" You nod. Always. It's your final morning at the villa, though no one says it aloud. There's an unspoken rhythm to farewells in Roman culture. Less about dramatic goodbyes, more about quiet nods, packed satchels, and a goat nibbling at your tunic while you look wistfully toward the horizon. You rise before the sun and are greeted by the general, not in the atrium or garden, but atop the villa's tallest watchtower. It's a modest structure by military standards, but from here, the entire estate fans out below you like an organized memory palace. You can trace the roof lines with your eyes, follow the paths between fig trees and columns, and even better, you remember exactly what's behind each door. This, the general says, is your final test. Reconstruct the day, he murmurs. But backward. You blink. Yes, backward. Begin from now and rewind moment by moment all the way back to your first step into the villa days ago. You start with the stairs beneath you, still cool from morning dew. The breeze that carried the scent of lavender. The cloak over your shoulders, slightly too large, borrowed from a servant who'd once been a senator's scribe. Then the conversations, the meals, the sound of the lyre, the cracked tile in the guest wing, the specific texture of the walnut ink on the scrolls. You keep going, eyes closed. As you narrate your memories aloud in reverse, a strange thing happens. They become sharper. It's as if turning time inside out reveals a structure you hadn't noticed before, like seeing the bones of a sculpture from underneath. This was another technique favored by aging Roman elites. Regressive recall, practicing time travel in your own mind. Historians still argue whether this practice was truly effective or simply a form of elite vanity. But there's anecdotal evidence, particularly in the writings of Seneca, that backward reflection deepens clarity and anchors emotions more firmly. The general interrupts your reflection with a question. Do you remember the olive? You pause. It's a trick. The olive was never explicitly important, just mentioned once in passing during a scroll demonstration. But in that moment, your brain unspools an entire visual. The olive's sheen, the way it rolled off the desk, the stain it left. Yes, you whisper. It bounced twice. He grins. That's how we know your mind is no longer wandering. It's watching. You descend from the tower and your final exercise begins, teaching someone else. The general leads you to the small courtyard where a young boy, his grandson perhaps, waits with ink-stained fingers and a look that says he'd rather be feeding goats. You sit beside him. Your task is simple. Pass on one technique you've learned. But, of course, you do more. You walk him through the basics of loci, then spice it up with jokes about tripping over amphorae and misplacing senators. You make him laugh. You teach him the reverse day trick. You even hum the 5-note melody while tapping his shoulder like a metronome. And here's the surprise, you remember it better by teaching it. This was the final Roman secret to cognitive longevity. Transmission. Not hoarding knowledge, but using your memory as a bridge to someone else's. They believed the mind was sharpened by generosity, that a memory not shared is a path not walked. By midday, your satchel is packed. A final meal is laid out. Nothing special, just barley stew, cheese, and a single figure. The general doesn't eat. He watches. You glance at him. Is this the end? He shrugs. Only if you forget to keep going. It's very Roman, that kind of answer. You begin your journey back down the hill, away from the villa, the marble statues, the scent of rosemary and old parchment. Each step echoes not with loss, but with rhythm, a cadence you've been training all week. As you walk, you inventory the memories once more. Your palace has grown, not just with places and objects and names, but with meaning. You carry Roman wisdom not as dusty facts, but as living architecture inside your mind, fortified by repetition, lit by curiosity, and swept clean by gentle attention. And somewhere, just beneath the birdsong and crunch of sandals on gravel, you hear the faintest music. 5 notes: the atrium, the scriptorium, the stables, the bathhouse, the olive press. You smile. The spiral of memory turns once more and holds. And now you rest. The villa fades into twilight behind your closed eyes, its arches bathed in soft gold, its walls lined with the stories you've gathered like pebbles in your palm. The breeze from the hills has stilled. The lyre strings have fallen quiet. Even the memory of footsteps on marble grows faint, like the echo of a dream already slipping from morning's reach. You don't need to recall every scroll, every statue, every clever maxim from a Roman philosopher. What you've kept, the rhythm, the rituals, the reverence for reflection, is enough. You've wandered through memory not as a scholar chasing perfection, but as a traveler tracing paths to stay awake inside yourself. That's the real secret, isn't it? Not eternal youth, not unbroken brilliance, but presence, kindness toward your own mind, a willingness to walk back through time, even if the path is cracked and crooked. Tonight, your thoughts settle like dust on an old mosaic, quiet, ancient, beautiful in its imperfection. You've earned that hush. You've earned the slow drift into sleep. So exhale just once, long and slow.